So it's myself, Emily, as Cedric said, and Jan Muir is my colleague here. To begin, some of you may know our office, but let me just give you a little bit of background. We're in the Office of Internal Oversight Services in the UN Secretariat. We're one of the 3 divisions. There's Audit, Investigations, and ourselves, which are Inspection and Evaluation Division. So we have that interesting acronym of IED, which sometimes gets some strange reactions, especially when we go to the peacekeeping missions. We are responsible for the evaluation function at the UN Secretariat, and in that regard, we cover the entire work program, which is quite broad, and under peace and security is where our peacekeeping evaluation work falls. We focus on assessing the relevance, efficiency, effectiveness, and impact of programs and thematic themes. And this comes from the program planning, budget, monitoring, and evaluation regulation that the UN Secretariat has. We also adhere to the UNEG norms and standards, which is the UN evaluation group, which most of our colleagues on this panel actually are members of. In terms of our work, we have limited resources, quality, not quantity, I guess, at this point. We have our chief, Rahul Sir, and ourselves, which are project leaders. Our topics are selected based on risk assessment, request, or mandate, and our focus is usually on the mandate achievement of missions. Our criteria, as I mentioned before, is usually relevance, efficiency, effectiveness, and/or impact. And our work plan tends to cover the annual cycle, which follows the support account for peacekeeping operations, which is 1 July to 30 June. And we do about 3 evaluations per year. In terms of our work, we do consult with the DPKO evaluation section, just to coordinate our work, make sure we know what each other's doing. And our reports are either submitted to the General Assembly and/or program managers, so some are public and some aren't. And for this presentation, we're just going to talk about the ones that are actually public. And in that regard, I will turn over to Jan so she can tell you about some of our work, the type that we do, and some recent findings.
That we typically do about 3 evaluations a year, and they will fall usually into 3 main categories. The first are our mission-specific evaluations, which focus on mandate implementation within a specific peacekeeping mission. We also do thematic evaluations, which look at particular themes or policy issues across the peacekeeping universe. And we do other work, which can include inspections and evaluations. In more recent years, we've been focusing on mission-specific evaluations. So since 2008, we've done 5 General Assembly reports that look at mandate implementation in particular missions, and you can see them listed there. They're usually the biggest, among the biggest of the peacekeeping missions, or those facing the most risk, according to our own assessment. Just recently, we've focused a little more on thematic evaluations. That was an early focus of ours that we've now, as a result of consultation, returned to. Recently, we've done 2 General Assembly reports, one on regional cooperation among peacekeeping missions, and another on the reporting of missions in relation to protection of civilians, which is a significant mandate element for probably around half of the peacekeeping missions currently in operation. We also have 2 thematic evaluations right now in progress. So Emily is leading an evaluation of protection against sexual exploitation and abuse within the context of peacekeeping, and I'm leading an evaluation of protection of civilians. And our other work does include inspections and the work, as Emily mentioned, that we do for program managers that typically does not become public. As we've looked at the missions over the last 5 years or so, we have noticed some common elements, and this is what you asked us to draw together for this seminar today. In terms of the more positive ones, we have observed without question that these peacekeeping missions do support peace processes and peace building in the countries in which they operate. And here are some words that I've just pulled out of some of our findings. In the case of MINUSCO, a critical enabling role it's playing there. We found MINUSCO showing tremendous resilience in the face of difficulty. We found UNMIL providing essential support and so forth. So very clearly they're providing a major contribution. We also know and take into account in our evaluations that they operate in very complex environments and with complex and sometimes increasingly complex mandates. And in terms of the requirement now for UN entities to integrate a gender perspective into all their activities, we now look at that as a standard part of our evaluations, and we have found, where we've looked at it, that most missions are successfully attempting to integrate a gender perspective. So in many cases, attention is paid, at least, and in some cases they're already achieving considerable success in mainstreaming a gender perspective across their work. In terms of the areas that have been seen to be more challenging for peacekeeping missions, one of them is disarmament, demobilization and reintegration, DDR, and while a lot has been achieved here, it really is one of the areas where challenges are frequently faced by missions. In the case of UNMIL and UNOSI, we documented some of those. We also did a thematic evaluation of DDR some years ago, which was a program manager's report, and that looked more generally at DDR experience across peacekeeping missions. The objectives of security sector reform and rule of law, which also every mission typically is working in the field of, is another very challenging area. And we've noted slow progress, multiple setbacks, serious challenges, words of this sort, to show that this is an area in which it has been very, very difficult to achieve significant progress for most missions. Cooperation and coordination with partners is also a continuing challenge, as I think we heard this morning as well. Every entity is looking at ways of doing this. So there are areas that we've noted remain challenges or need strengthening. We also did a thematic evaluation of regional cooperation or cooperation with regional organizations just 2 years ago, and that found, again, while there'd been a lot of progress, considerable scope for improvement. Those were the common elements that we've tended to find in our mission evaluations, but of course there are differences as well, and some of these differences occur in the areas of integrated planning, protection of civilians, reporting, and their ability to manage or influence their external environment. And so some missions clearly are doing this with more success than others, and for very different reasons. When we notice challenges, we make recommendations. And our recommendations do address identified challenges. In the past, we used to make lots of recommendations, and they were reasonably prescriptive and activity-based. They said what we thought needed to happen to change. Now we're moving more towards outcome-oriented recommendations, where we say what we think the outcome needs to be, but we leave some scope for the evaluand organisation to determine how that can best be achieved in their own context. We try to make our recommendations SMART, meaning specific, measurable, actionable, realistic, and time-bound, and we do track them. Emily will talk about that in a minute. We also classify them into critical, important, and opportunities for improvement, and the tracking intensity reflects those categories we give them. And we have decided that less is more, and now we make actually quite limited numbers of recommendations, even after quite extensive evaluations, to focus solely on the most important elements. Okay, Emily.
Sure. So in terms of recommendations, we do require implementation, and we ask the evaluant to actually give us an action plan immediately once the report is issued that we review with them and approve for action. And then we do track the recommendations for 3 years, the frequency of which within these 3 years depends on the criticality that we actually gave it. It could be anywhere from every 3 months to twice a year. We also have an annual report that the office actually submits on all of its recommendations to the General Assembly. So there is a bit of an incentive for the evaluant to actually be implementing the recommendations, because they are going to be held accountable by both ourselves and the General Assembly. In terms of the challenges and the strengths of conducting our evaluations, a big challenge, as both Cedric and Alan had mentioned, is the issue of data availability and reliability, particularly when we get further on into the results chain, and particularly when we get into attribution or contribution to a process. So we're always trying to sort of factor that in when we're doing our work. Additionally, as Cedric had mentioned, the role of political factors is very important in our work, and we need to be very mindful of it, of how it might influence the peacekeeping policy and the actual practice on the ground in these missions. Some of the strengths that we've noticed over time, though, is that the more peacekeeping operations that actually happen and occur, there has been lesson learning, and they are actually applying it back in their work. And that we've actually seen some initiatives to try and improve some efficiency in terms of some of the common peacekeeping work with guidances and guidelines, such as on gender mainstreaming or DDR. A couple of things on our evaluations. While we don't actually have the opportunity to go back systematically and find out how our recommendations actually did change the work on the ground other than tracking the recommendations, we do feel that our reports do have an impact because of a couple of distinguishing features. One is that we're internal to the UN Secretariat, but we're quite independent, and we have a very strong and clear mandate. We have access to all the information and people within the UN Secretariat to do our work. We have these very visible outputs in terms of the public reports, and we're one of the only evaluation units that actually have that. Our recommendations are very binding. And we're very familiar with the environment within which DPKO and then also the decisions are being made in terms of the missions. As Jan had mentioned, we are changing our focus a little bit. We've already been focusing on results, but now we've got a renewed focus on it now. After an external review we had last year where they really requested that we focus more on results rather than outputs and processes of the missions and the particular themes that we might look at. And so this has been driving our focus at this point in terms of our risk assessment that we conduct, the scoping of the actual work we're going to do, and then our actual overall reporting. This is also consistent with our governing bodies. We found that they too want to know about results more than outputs and processes. And it's also obviously consistent with results-based management and the organizational definition of accountability. And that actually brings us to the end of our presentation, so hopefully we caught up a little bit on the time. But we'd welcome questions either now or at the end, whether now or we have some contact information here if you want to have the conversation go on a little bit longer in the future.
Thank you. That was really enlightening, very interesting. I'm surprised in a sense to the degree that I'm thinking of my own office that are working on these issues and that we don't know enough about what you're doing. And so we need to spend more time learning from what you are, the very interesting things that you are engaged in.
And we'd be very happy to engage in a discussion like that. So.
Excellent. Then we're going to move on to Stefan and then come back to questions and discussion afterwards.